Professor Sterling thought he was about to deliver the ultimate humiliation. He pointed at the board, laughed with the elite students, and dared the quiet kid in the back to solve the impossible equation. He wanted to prove that Elias didn't belong in this Ivy League hall. But as the entire class roared with laughter, Elias didn't flinch. He walked down the steps, picked up the chalk, and whispered two words that turned the professor's blood cold. "Try me." Little did Sterling know he hadn't just picked a fight with a student. He had just made the big mistake of challenging a hidden genius. And the look on the professor's face? It was the exact moment he realized he knew. The lecture hall at Harrison University was a place of old wood, expensive perfumes, and a suffocating sense of hierarchy. At the very top row, shrouded in the shadows of the back bench, sat Elias. To his classmates, he was a non-entity, a scholarship kid who wore the same faded black hoodie every day and never raised his hand. They called him the Ghost. He was there, but he didn't exist in their world of trust funds and legacy admissions. Down at the front stood Professor Sterling, a man whose ego was as large as his list of publications. Sterling didn't just teach mathematics, he used it as a weapon to weed out those he deemed unworthy. Today he was in a particularly predatory mood. He had spent 20 minutes scribbling a monstrosity of an equation across the blackboard, a chaotic web of Greek symbols, triple integrals, and nonlinear variables that looked more like modern art than math. "This," Sterling announced, tapping the board with a silver pointer, "is the Vanguard problem. It has remained unsolved by the brightest minds in this university for over half a century. It is the wall that separates the thinkers from the dreamers." He turned to the class, a predatory smirk stretching across his face. He didn't want a volunteer, he wanted a victim. His eyes scanned the room, bypassing the frantic honors students, and landed directly on the boy in the shadows. "Mr. Elias," Sterling's voice boomed, dripping with sarcasm, "you've spent the last hour staring at your old notebook. Perhaps the Vanguard problem is too simple for your brilliant mind? Why don't you come down and show us how a prodigy handles a real challenge?" A wave of snickering erupted. The elites, a group of wealthy students in the front row, began to whisper loudly. "Does he even know what a derivative is?" one mocked. "He looks like he's lost on his way to the cafeteria," another chimed in. Professor Sterling didn't silence them. He encouraged it. He wanted Elias to feel the weight of his perceived inadequacy. "Don't be shy, Elias, unless of course the rumors are true and you only got in here to fill a quota." The humiliation was sharp. It was calculated. The entire class was laughing, their eyes fixed on the nobody at the back. For a long moment, Elias didn't move. He just looked at the board. To anyone else, it was a mess of symbols. To him, it was a song he had heard 1,000 times. Slowly, Elias stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor was like a gunshot in the room. The laughter died down into a taunting hum. As he walked down the steep stairs of the lecture hall, the professor stood back, crossing his arms over his expensive suit. He was already rehearsing the speech he would give when Elias failed. A lecture on why some people are born to lead and others are born to follow. Elias reached the front. He stood a full head taller than Sterling, but he kept his gaze fixed on the chalk dust on the floor. "Bet you can't even solve the first line, can you?" Sterling whispered, leaning in so only Elias could hear. "Go ahead, make a fool of yourself. Give them the show they paid for." Elias finally turned his head. His eyes weren't filled with shame or fear. They were calm. Terrifyingly calm. It was the look of a predator watching a bird fly into a glass window. "Try me," Elias said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to the very back of the room. The professor's smirk flickered for a fraction of a second. He watched as Elias's hand reached out and gripped a piece of white chalk. This was the moment the atmosphere in the room shifted. The invisible student was gone. In his place stood someone who looked at the blackboard not with confusion, but with authority. The students in the front row leaned forward, their smirks fading. They expected a tragedy. They were about to witness a revolution. Elias didn't hesitate. He didn't check a textbook or look at his notes. He raised the chalk to the top left corner of the board and began to write. The sound of the chalk hitting the slate was rhythmic, fast, and aggressive. Snap, scrape, snap. Within seconds, the first line of the unsolvable Vanguard problem was rewritten into a simplified geometric proof. Professor Sterling's jaw didn't drop yet. That would come later. But his eyes widened. He recognized that proof. It wasn't in any textbook. It was a theoretical shortcut that had only been discussed in high-level research papers 3 months ago. How did he know that? Sterling thought, his heart skipping a beat. The class went silent. The laughter was officially dead. Elias wasn't just solving it, he was deconstructing it. He was moving across the board with a speed that felt inhuman. Every symbol he wrote felt like a slap to Sterling's ego. As Elias finished the first section and moved to the middle of the board, he paused for a second. He turned his head just enough to look at the professor. "You made a mistake in the third variable, Professor," Elias said quietly. "That's why no one could solve it for 50 years. You were asking the wrong question." Sterling felt a cold chill run down his spine. He looked at his own equation. He looked at Elias's correction. His breath hitched. The boy was right. This was the beginning of the end for Professor Sterling's career. He had set a trap for a student he thought was beneath him, but he had accidentally awakened a giant. He had made a big mistake. And as Elias turned back to the board to finish the impossible problem, everyone in the room realized one thing. The quiet kid didn't just belong here, he owned the place. The atmosphere in the lecture hall didn't just turn cold, it became vacuum-sealed. Professor Sterling stood frozen, his eyes darting between the chalkboard and the boy he had just tried to destroy. To the students in the front row, the shift was physical. They could see the subtle tremor in the professor's hand as he gripped his silver pointer. The laughter that had filled the room moments ago was replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable tension. Sterling was a man who built his reputation on being untouchable. He was the titan of mathematics, a man whose ego was reinforced by years of academic dominance. To have a nobody, a student who looked like he had just walked off a construction site, correct a variable in the university's most famous unsolved problem was not just an insult, it was an existential threat. "You think I made a mistake?" Sterling's voice cracked slightly before he regained his haughty composure. He forced a dry, hollow laugh. "Mr. Elias, do you have any idea who wrote that equation? It was refined by Nobel laureates. To suggest a fundamental error in the third variable is the height of arrogance. It's exactly the kind of uneducated guesswork I expected from someone like you." Elias didn't look back. He kept his chalk poised against the black slate. "It's not guesswork, Professor. You treated the non-linear variable as a constant to make the proof look more elegant, but elegance isn't truth. By forcing it to be a constant, you created a mathematical paradox that makes the final derivation impossible. You weren't teaching us math. You were teaching us how to lie with symbols." The class gasped. No one spoke to Sterling like that. The elites looked at each other, their smirks replaced by genuine confusion. One of them, a student named Marcus, whose father was a major donor to the university, called out, "Sir, just kick him out already. He's just wasting time with nonsense." But Sterling couldn't kick him out. Not yet. If he kicked Elias out now, the correction on the board would remain, a silent witness to a potential mistake. He had to prove Elias wrong in front of everyone. He had to crush him completely so that no one would ever question Sterling's authority again. "Very well," Sterling hissed, stepping closer to Elias, his shadow looming over the student. "Since you are so certain of your correction, let's raise the stakes. If you can derive the second phase of this problem using your supposed truth, I will personally give you an A for the entire year. But," he paused, his eyes narrowing into slits, "if you fail, if you write one more incorrect stroke on this board, you will leave this university today. You will be expelled for academic fraud and for disrespecting the faculty. Do we have a deal, or are you going to crawl back to your shadow?"
The stakes were now astronomical. Expulsion from Harrison University meant the end of Elias's future. For a scholarship student, there was no second chance. The room was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Elias finally turned to face the professor. Up close, the contrast was jarring. Sterling was in a three-piece suit, smelling of expensive cologne and old money. Elias was in a hoodie that had seen better days, smelling of nothing but the rain he had walked through to get to class. But it was Elias who looked like the one in control. "An A doesn't matter to me, Professor," Elias said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "But I'll finish it. Not for the grade, but because this equation deserves to be solved correctly for once." Sterling stepped back, a wicked smile playing on his lips. "The floor is yours, genius. Let's see what you've got." Sterling believed he was setting a trap. He knew that the second phase of the Vanguard problem required a mastery of stochastic calculus and fluid dynamics, concepts that weren't even introduced until the third year of the PhD program. He was certain Elias was just a lucky guesser who had stumbled upon a minor typo. He expected Elias to hit a wall within the next 30 seconds. Elias turned back to the board. He closed his eyes for a split second, visualizing the numbers. In his mind, the chalkboard wasn't a flat surface, it was a three-dimensional map. He saw the variables flowing like water, and he saw exactly where Sterling had tried to dam the river. Snap! The chalk hit the board again. This time, Elias didn't just write, he attacked. He began to derive the second phase, using a method that left Sterling's jaw hanging. He wasn't using the standard Harrison University notation. He was using a high-level symbolic logic that was rarely seen outside of classified research labs. As Elias's hand moved, the board began to fill with beautiful, complex structures. He was bypassing pages of tedious work with brilliant, intuitive leaps. Sterling watched, his face turning from pale to a ghostly white. He began to recognize the patterns. They weren't just correct, they were revolutionary. He realized that Elias wasn't just a student who had studied hard, he was a prodigy. But the professor's ego wouldn't let him admit it. Instead of being proud to have such a student, he felt a burning, poisonous envy. He looked at the laughing students who were now staring in absolute silence, their phones out, recording the moment. He realized that if Elias finished this, Sterling's career as the top mind in the department would be over. He would be known as the man who was outshone by a freshman in a hoodie. "Stop," Sterling whispered, but Elias didn't stop. "I said stop," Sterling shouted, reaching for Elias's arm. Elias spun around, his eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp intensity that made the professor flinch. "I'm not finished, Professor. You set the stakes. You told the class to watch. Now, watch." Elias turned back and wrote the final line of the second phase. He circled a specific value, a value that Sterling had claimed for years was unreachable. Elias dropped the chalk. It shattered on the floor. "That," Elias said, pointing to the circled number, "is the true limit of the Vanguard problem. Phase 2 is complete, and it proves that your entire curriculum for the last 10 years has been based on a false premise." The silence in the room was deafening. It was the sound of a kingdom falling. Professor Sterling looked at the board, then at the camera lenses of the students' phones, then back at Elias. He realized he had made the big mistake of his life. He had tried to mock a boy who didn't just know the answers, he lived them. But the real shock was yet to come, because while the class thought the show was over, Elias was just getting warmed up. He hadn't just solved the problem, he was about to reveal why he knew it so well. And the secret was something that would shake the very foundations of the university. The lecture hall was a theater of the absurd. For the first 10 minutes of the period, Elias had been nothing more than a punchline. The laughter hadn't just been noise, it had been a collective agreement among the privileged that the boy in the hoodie didn't belong. When Professor Sterling first pointed his silver rod at the blackboard, the snickering was a background hum, like static electricity before a storm. "Look at him," whispered Chloe, a student whose tuition cost more than Elias's family home. "He looks like he's trying to read a foreign language." The laughter intensified when Elias took his first slow step toward the front. It was a cruel, sharp sound. Even the students who didn't usually participate in the bullying joined in, swept up in the magnetic field of Professor Sterling's arrogance. They laughed because it was safe. They laughed because Sterling was the authority, and Sterling had decided that Elias was a failure. Sterling himself was the conductor of this orchestra of mockery. "Careful not to trip on the truth on your way down, Mr. Elias," he had barked, prompting another roar from the front rows. He had set the stage for a public execution of a young man's dignity. But then, Elias reached the board. The transition from laughter to silence didn't happen all at once. It started in the front row, the row closest to the chalk. Marcus, the student who had been loudest in his mockery, stopped mid-laugh. His mouth stayed open, but the sound died in his throat. He saw Elias's hand. It wasn't shaking. In fact, it was the steadiest thing in the room. As Elias began to write the first correction, the silence spread like a drop of ink in a glass of water. It moved from the front row to the middle and finally to the back. The air in the room seemed to thin out. The students, who had been recording for a fail video, suddenly realized they were filming something else entirely. "Wait," someone whispered from the fifth row. "What is he doing? That's not the standard derivation." Professor Sterling's face was a study in collapsing ego. The smirk that had been etched into his features for 20 years was beginning to crack. He looked at the students, expecting them to continue the joke, but he found no allies. Their eyes were glued to the blackboard. The very people he had trained to look down on Elias were now looking up at the board in awe. Elias continued to write, the chalk snapping with every decisive stroke. He was moving through the variables with a grace that made Sterling's earlier work look like a child's scribbles. Every time Elias crossed out one of Sterling's constants and replaced it with a dynamic variable, it was like a physical blow to the professor's chest. He's correcting the professor," a girl in the third row murmured, her voice filled with a mix of fear and admiration. The silence was now so profound that the only sound was the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the chalk and Elias's steady breathing. This was the true curiosity loop in action. Every student in that room was trapped in a state of cognitive dissonance. How could the invisible student, the ghost, the scholarship quota, be doing what tenured professors had failed to do for 50 years? Sterling tried to regain control. He cleared his throat, the sound jarring in the quiet room. "Mr. Elias, while your creative approach is entertaining, you are clearly diverging from established academic protocols. This is a university, not a playground for what-if scenarios." Elias stopped. He didn't turn around. He just tilted his head slightly toward the professor. "Protocols are for people who don't understand the logic, Professor. You use protocols to hide the fact that you hit a dead end in 1994. I'm not playing what if. I'm showing you what is." A few students gasped. Marcus, the bully from before, actually leaned forward, his eyes wide. He wasn't laughing anymore. He was leaning in, trying to understand the math. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at Elias's clothes. He was looking at Elias's mind. Elias turned back to the board and began the final section of part 3. He wasn't just solving the Vanguard problem anymore. He was expanding it. He began to link the mathematical proof to quantum thermodynamics, a field Sterling barely understood. As the board filled with Elias's work, the silence transformed from uncomfortable to reverent. The students realized they weren't watching a student struggle. They were watching a master at work. They were witnessing the exact moment a legend was born. The big mistake Sterling had made wasn't just challenging Elias. It was doing it in front of a generation that grew up with cameras in their pockets. Every second of Sterling's humiliation was being broadcast to the cloud. The he knew moment was now immortalized.
Look at the professor's face, Chloe whispered, pointing her phone. Sterling looked like a man watching his house burn down while he was still inside. He realized that the laughter he had orchestrated had turned into a funeral march for his reputation. He had tried to mock a prodigy, and in doing so, he had exposed himself as a fraud. Elias reached the bottom right corner of the blackboard. There was no space left. He wrote the final integer, a simple, elegant 0. The Vanguard problem isn't an infinite loop, Elias said, finally turning to face the class. It's a zero-sum equation. It balances perfectly once you remove the ego from the math. He dropped the remaining piece of chalk. It hit the floor and shattered into white dust. Elias walked back to his seat in the shadows. This time no one laughed, no one whispered. As he walked past the rows of elite students, they instinctively moved back, giving him a wide berth, not out of mockery, but out of a sudden, deep-seated respect. The silence held for a full minute after Elias sat down. Professor Sterling remained at the front, staring at the board as if it were a ghost. He tried to speak, but no words came out. He had set out to prove Elias didn't belong, but as he looked at the brilliant, undeniable truth written in white chalk, he realized the terrifying truth. He was the one who didn't belong. But the mystery was only deepening, because as the class stared at the board, one student, a quiet girl named Sarah who worked in the university archives, noticed something. The way Elias wrote his sevens and the way he structured his proofs, it looked familiar. "Professor?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Look at the signature style of the proof. Doesn't that look like the Newton X papers from the late 90s? The ones that were retracted because they were too advanced for the time?" Sterling's eyes went even wider. He looked at the board again. He looked at the ghost in the back row. "Elias," Sterling whispered, his voice trembling. Who exactly taught you that derivation?" Elias didn't look up from his notebook. "My father taught me, Professor, the man whose career you destroyed so you could take his tenure." The silence in the room broke into 1,000 pieces. The revelation of Elias's lineage hit the room like a physical shockwave. The air in the lecture hall, once thick with the professor's smug superiority, was now heavy with the weight of a decade-old injustice. Sarah's mention of the Newton X papers had pulled the thread that was about to unravel Professor Sterling's entire, carefully constructed life. Elias remained seated, his posture unchanged, but the energy radiating from him was no longer that of a ghost. He was a reckoning. Sterling, on the other hand, looked as though he had seen a phantom. His face transitioned from the pale white of shock to a sickly mottled gray. The big mistake wasn't just a mathematical error anymore. It was a historical one. "Your father," Sterling stammered, his hand clutching the edge of the mahogany podium so hard his knuckles turned white. "You're Arthur Vance's son?" Elias finally stood up again. This time, he didn't wait for an invitation. He walked toward the front of the room with a deliberate, predatory slowness. The students watched in total silence, their cameras still rolling. They were no longer just watching a math solution. They were watching a cold case trial play out in real time. "Arthur Vance was the most brilliant mind this university ever saw," Elias said, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "He didn't just solve the Vanguard problem, he created a new language for physics. But he was invisible to people like you, Professor. He didn't have the right last name. He didn't have the elite connections. So, when he presented his Newton X proofs, you didn't just reject them. You called them academic fraud. You had him blacklisted, stole his research, and used his foundations to build your own tenure." Sterling's eyes darted toward the students. He was looking for an escape, for a way to turn the narrative back to his favor. That's a baseless accusation. Arthur Vance's work was flawed. It was unstable. It was only unstable because you purposely omitted the third variable when you published it under your own name, Elias countered, now standing just inches from the blackboard. "You wanted the glory, but you didn't have the brain to understand the full picture. You've been sitting in this chair for 10 years, terrified that someone would eventually look at the board and see the lie. And today you were arrogant enough to invite the one person who could expose it. Elias reached down. The chalk he had dropped earlier lay in pieces on the floor. He picked up a fresh, long piece of white chalk. This was the true turning point, the picking up the chalk moment that your title promised. In the first half of the lecture, the chalk was a tool for a student to solve a problem. Now it was a scalpel intended to cut out a cancer. "You challenged me to finish Phase 2, Elias whispered, his voice vibrating with a decade of suppressed anger. But Phase 2 was just the entry point. Phase 3 is where the Newton X proofs actually begin. It's the part you hidden from the world because it proves your 10-year research was a total fabrication." Elias turned back to the board. If his previous writing was aggressive, this was explosive. He didn't just write, he carved the symbols into the slate. He began to map out a multi-dimensional proof that bridged the gap between classical mathematics and theoretical quantum mechanics. The students in the front row, including Marcus and Chloe, were now standing up. They couldn't stay seated. The math was so beautiful, so complex, yet so logical that even those who struggled with basic calculus could feel its power. It was like watching a master musician play a symphony that hadn't been heard in centuries. As Elias wrote, he spoke, narrating the betrayal. Line 44, "This is where you claim the energy decayed. But my father proved it was a constant." Line 89, "You claimed the limit was unreachable. My father showed it was the starting point." Professor Sterling was collapsing. He had retreated to the far corner of the stage, his eyes wide and vacant. He was watching his big mistake manifest in real time. He knew that among the thousands of people who would eventually see the videos being recorded, there would be experts, peer reviewers, department heads. By the time this class was over, the world would know that Sterling was a thief. "He's not just solving math," Sarah whispered to the student next to her. "He's writing a confession for the professor." Elias reached the center of the board. He drew a line through the very first equation Sterling had written, the impossible one. He didn't just correct it, he deleted it. "The Vanguard problem was never a problem, Professor," Elias said, turning his head back to look at the broken man in the corner. "It was a test of integrity, and you failed it every single day for 10 years. The chalk snapped in Elias's hand, but he didn't stop. He used the small nub to write the final, devastating conclusion of the Newton X proof. The answer wasn't a number. It was a functional identity that bore his father's initials, a V-1. "He knew," Elias said, pointing to the initials. "My father knew you would steal it. He left a trap in the logic, a logical knot that only someone who actually understood the core theory could untie. You've been trying to untie it for a decade, haven't you, Sterling? But you couldn't, because you aren't a mathematician. You're a librarian who forgot where he put the books." The room was so quiet that the sound of a distant car horn outside felt like a bomb going off. Elias turned away from the board, his hands covered in white dust. He looked at the professor one last time, not with hatred, but with a cold, devastating pity. "You told me that if I failed, I would be expelled for academic fraud," Elias reminded him. "But I didn't fail. The math is perfect, which means the fraud in this room is you." Elias walked toward the exit. As he reached the heavy oak doors, he paused. He didn't look back at the professor. He looked at the students, the elite, the wealthy, the people who had laughed at him only 40 minutes ago. "Class is dismissed," Elias said. He pushed the doors open and walked out into the bright afternoon sun, leaving behind a shattered career and a legend that would be talked about for generations. But as he walked away, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. A woman in a sharp suit stepped out, holding a folder with the Harrison University seal. "Mr. Vance?" she asked. "The dean would like to have a word, not about your expulsion, but about your father's chair." The story was far from over. The Prodigy had taken back the chalk, and now he was about to take back the entire university. The heavy oak doors of the lecture hall hadn't even finished swinging shut behind Elias when the digital world began to explode. Within seconds, the videos recorded by Marcus, Chloe, and dozens of others were hitting social media platforms. The hashtags #NewtonX and #ProfessorFraud began to trend globally, but inside the hall the silence remained, thick and suffocating. Professor Sterling was still standing in the corner, staring at the blackboard as if the white chalk marks were bars of a cage he had built for himself. The first line of truth wasn't just a mathematical correction. It was a physical manifestation of a decade-long crime. As the students began to filter out, some in shock, others whispering frantically into their phones, a small group stayed behind. Among them was Sarah, the archival student who had first recognized the Newton X proofs. She walked up to the board, her eyes scanning the complex web of equations Elias had left behind. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Sterling didn't move. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. His big mistake was now being analyzed by thousands of mathematics professors across the globe in real time. He knew that by tomorrow, every paper he had ever published would be under a microscope. The foundation of his life, his tenure, his awards, his luxurious apartment overlooking the campus, was dissolving into chalk dust. Meanwhile, in the administrative wing of Harrison University, the atmosphere was chaotic. Dean Elias Vance, no relation to Elias, had been alerted to the situation 3 minutes after the first video went viral. She sat in her office watching the footage of Elias deconstructing Sterling's ego. "The boy is Arthur's son," she murmured, her heart heavy with a guilt she had carried since the Newton X papers were first retracted 10 years ago. She had been on the committee that listened to Sterling's accusations against Arthur. She had been one of the people who voted to blacklist him. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was the woman in the sharp suit, the university's chief legal counsel. "We have a situation, Eleanor," the lawyer said, placing a folder on the desk. "If what that boy wrote on the board is true, Harrison University is looking at a massive lawsuit, not just from the Vance family, but from the donors and the academic board. We've been harboring a fraud for a decade." "Where is the boy?" the dean asked. "He's in the courtyard. I've already sent a car to bring him here," the lawyer replied. "But Eleanor, look at the math in the video. Even our best faculty members can't follow the final derivation. Elias didn't just solve the problem, he pushed physics forward by 20 years in a single lecture." The courtyard confrontation. Outside, Elias stood near a stone fountain, his hands still stained with the white chalk of his father's legacy. He felt a strange sense of emptiness. For 10 years, his life had been a series of he knew moments. Moments where he watched his father struggle in poverty while Sterling's face appeared on the covers of academic journals. He had spent his childhood learning math from a man who had lost everything but his genius. "Elias?" He turned to see Marcus and Chloe standing a few feet away. The elites no longer looked down at him. They looked at him with something resembling fear, the kind of fear people have when they realize they've been mocking a king in disguise. "I just wanted to say," Marcus started, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. "I didn't know. About your father. About Sterling. We were idiots." Elias looked at Marcus. "You weren't idiots, Marcus. You were just well-trained. You were taught that clothes and money determine intelligence. That was your big mistake. My father always said that math is the only true democracy. Numbers don't care who your father is or how much your hoodie cost." Chloe stepped forward, holding her phone. "Elias, the video has 3 million views. The Mathematics Association of America just tweeted. They want to verify the proof. They're calling it the Vance-Newton identity." Elias smiled for the first time. A sad, thin smile. It was always his. I just wrote it down for him. Back in the lecture hall, the investigation had already begun, though not in the way Sterling expected. A group of senior faculty members led by the head of the physics department, Dr. Elias Thorne, had arrived. They didn't even look at Sterling. They went straight to the board. Dr. Thorne put on his glasses and followed Elias's work line by line. His face, usually a mask of stoicism, began to break into a look of pure astonishment.